Good evening, and thank you very much to Corinne for that wonderful introduction. I fear I have a lot to live up to, so I hope that I can meet the billing that has been given. Starting, I think, with a little bit of an introduction to the topic of the rule of law and online communities before we actually get into hacking. This is a new area for lawyers. We must remember that law is an ancient art, and it's also an art which is very conservative and can take a considerable period of time to adapt to change. So it took around 200 years from the invention of the printing press to the passing of the first copyright laws. So given that the internet was developed in 1969, I'm assuming that we'll get to grips with regulating online communities somewhere around 2170. So the first thing to get clear is we're very much behind the curve. The subject of cyber law or cyber regulation is very new to UK universities. I started teaching a course in it in the year 2000, and it was really around about that time, the time of the dot-com bubble, when people recognized value in online assets and value in online investments, that people started asking their lawyers for advice on how to protect these values and these investments. Before then, the internet had been seen very much as a niche, or even as an unregulated Wild West, where lawyers were not needed and not really desired. This is part of the problem. The problem is that the technology moves very, very quickly, and some of the technologies I'm going to talk about tonight are extremely young. The societies and communities around both the technologies and generally the online culture form and dissipate extremely quickly, massively quickly. And think how law responds to these things. How long does it take for the UK Parliament to pass an act? Forget how long it takes the UK Parliament to pass an act. How long does it take the European Union to agree to make a change to law? Or think how long it takes for an international agreement to be made through treaties and other agreements. It takes us far too long. By the time we realize what the problem is, it's too late for us to do anything about it. So we're playing catch up. That being said, lawyers are getting better at catching up. We're closing the gap between the event and the reaction. But the first part of the message is that for most people online, the rule of law is illusory. There is no rule of law because the law does not understand them. It does not understand their community. It does not understand what they are doing. And when it does eventually catch up and understands, they've already moved on to something else. So we can see this in a number of examples. The thing that moves faster than the law is the media. And this is why, by an almost daily report in the media, you find out what the latest problem is in terms of online law and online regulation. So this week, it's mostly regulating Twitter and preventing defamation. I'm sure you've all followed the fact that a number of people made defamatory comments about an ex-Conservative Party grandee and suggested he had been involved in very unsavoury practices, which I'm happy to clarify for the purposes of this being recorded, he was not involved with. I'm happy not to be in the receiving end of another writ. He's had to deal with the problem of how do you regulate a community of people who are perhaps global, who don't even think about what they're doing, what they're saying. It's a culture of retweeting. It's a culture of very quickly disseminating information before you think about it. He's came up with the get out the big guns approach. He's employed a major city firm who specialize in this area. They have sent letters to a number of prominent people involved in tweeting this information. And they have now made an announcement today that another group of less well-known movers in the Twitter community will be able to settle for the payment of £5, which will go into a charity fund to be donated later to charity. This is a simple way for them to deal with the problem. Why are they doing this? They could be doing it, and I hope they're doing it, because the individual involved has decided that the best thing to do is to put it behind him, to ask people to make a nominal donation, to reflect on what they have done, and to move on. It could be because his lawyers presented him with a bill of how much it was going to cost to pursue every case by making a Norwich Pharmacal application in California, by getting the details back, by pursuing the individuals, and if necessary, by raising an action against them. And then, if you did all that, did they have any assets with which they would actually be able to pay? So he may have taken this approach simply because it was discretion was the better part of valor. We don't know which it is. I hope it's the former and not the latter. But it immediately demonstrates the problem. And we have a number of online problem communities that do not represent or recognize the rule of law. Twitter is very famously one of them. Why does Twitter not recognize the rule of law? Well, it's because it's a very strange community. It's not like all of us here tonight. We don't share common interests and common values. We do, they don't. They don't share even a common approach to what law should apply. Instead, they're a community made up of people globally. They come together, they form around particular interests, and then they fall away again. Now, there are following people, but that doesn't create any kind of shared values. And this is true of all the online communities. Online communities come from different cultural backgrounds, different expectations, different values, and they form very quickly and sometimes around single interest policies. So a single thing can set people off to come together and to form together and to then say this is for them at this time incredibly important. Important enough to break the law in many cases. And whether it's tweeting defamatory comments about conservative grandees, whether it's sharing music or films or television in breach of copyright, whether it is surround hacking and breaking into other people's websites, these people all strongly believe in their interests, and they believe their interests outweigh the rule of law. So I'm going to start by actually talking about the general problem of regulating online communities. The specifics of the actual hacking communities will come later. I think there's a general thing we can all learn about why communities break the law online. And it's not just true of hacking communities, it's true of many. Let's think for a moment about how law works. For some of you in the room are lawyers or work in the law, this is something which is known clearly. For others, you might not think about why people comply with the law and how it brings people to comply. Generally, we start with someone in authority. The someone in authority is the lawmaker, or if it's perhaps not public law, if it's a private regulatory regime, they will be the regulator. That person promulgates the law. They are the law in a very real sense. They have the ability to change the law and to formulate new laws. So this person is the lawmaker who regulates a group of people. So this is our bottom group, our citizen or regulatee down here. So the rule of law is simply an instruction from someone in authority, someone with legitimacy in authority, to tell us what, as a community, we agree we can and cannot do in the interests of the greater community. And the rule of law, or the law that is passed, can have several reasons. It can be for the interests of the community through criminal law. It can be for the functioning of markets. It can be for certainty in things like property and contracts. But it's all doing the same thing. It's creating a framework. And this is the framework that we all agree to live by. This is our part of the contract. But of course, not everybody agrees with the framework. There are always law breakers, and people will break the law for a number of reasons. They will break the law because of economic self-interest. They will break the law because they have a particular criminal intent. They will break the law because they just don't agree with the law, activism. These people are deviant, so they break the law and move into this deviant group. This is a problem. Now we have someone who's not following the rule of the rest of society. How do we sort this problem? Well, we must first detect that deviation. So we have people that we pay to be detectors. In criminal law, it's the police force. In financial services law, it's somebody like the Financial Services Authority. So we have someone who detects what's going on, they detect the deviation, and then they correct for this deviation. And this may be sending someone to prison, it may be a fine, it may be a regulatory order, it may be an order to enforce a contract, but in general, the legal system is there to pick up deviation. And this is the way that we've run our legal systems for several hundred years. And it works very well in the real world when we can recognize who is the legitimate lawmaker and where we have bodies in place to detect and to ensure that people are brought back into the mainstream. Some people may never be brought back into the mainstream. That doesn't mean the law has failed. It means the law has failed them. It doesn't mean the law has failed. It's very important to understand that. So how does this person, this lawmaker at the top, how do they get authority to tell us what to do? What gives them this particular position? Well, again, if we look at the science of law, if we look at the jurisprudence, we find that there are a number of reasons that people gain legitimacy. So historically, there is the jure divino, there is the divine right. So ancient kings had the right to tell us what to do because God had anointed them to rule over us. This is not a very fashionable way to think about legal systems today, although it's not necessarily died out. But that is a simple example. Why do I have authority? I have authority because God has given it to me. Today, we usually look at other forms of legitimacy for lawmakers. So the most common ones would be perhaps from the social contract. This is a model which became very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. People like Rousseau, who said that the reason we give authority to lawmakers is because it actually makes us all better and it makes society work for us. Without us agreeing that somebody has the right to tell us what to do, we end up in chaos and disorder, and everybody will be interested in their self-interest, not in the interest of the community. So it essentially sees law as a communitarian aspect, that law is there to make us and our community function. There are other models. There is the positivist rule of law, which says essentially if the law gives you authority, then you have authority to be the lawmaker. It's actually almost quite a circular argument, but it's a very strong one and often draws principles in countries where there are strong constitutions. It's very popular in the United States, where authority to govern comes from the constitutional settlement, so you don't need to show anything else. Often today, it's recognized by external validation. So often today, it's actions of bodies like the United Nations who say, we recognize you, you're a state, you're a government, and by recognizing you, we give you our imprimatur of authority, and that gives you the ability to regulate your citizens. So this is the traditional model. This is very much away from what you were expecting, but we are getting back towards the online communities. The traditional model says we can recognize a lawmaker, that lawmaker has authority, and the lawmaker has an apparatus of state to ensure that that authority is followed. So why doesn't this work online? Why do online communities, more than offline communities, seem keen to ignore the rule of law and seem willing to ignore the rule of law? Why did 10,000 UK plus, why did 10,000 UK citizens think it was perfectly okay to suggest that a senior member of or ex-member of a political party was involved in paedophilic activity? Why did they not think? Do you think they would have ran down the street shouting, Lord McAlpine is a paedophile? They would not have done that. Yet somehow or other they felt it was okay to say this on Twitter. And Lord McAlpine has taken what is probably the only sensible recourse to people who do this. So why does it not work? Well, here's one reason why it doesn't work. Why online communities are more likely to hack, ignore laws, breach laws than offline communities. It's a simple problem of too many lawmakers. We can't actually recognize who the lawmaker is any longer. This is a thesis that was developed by a group of American law professors who collectively are called cyber libertarians. And they argue that the problem online is we can't actually tell whose rule of law we should follow any longer. So if I'm a citizen of California and I put up a note on a UK-based website which is defamatory of a UK citizen, do I abide the British laws, which say that I can be sued for defamation, or do I follow the Californian laws, which say I'm protected by the First Amendment? Both apply, but also both don't apply at the same time. What about if I don't know where the web server is based and I'm unaware that I've published this in the United Kingdom? I think it was actually published in Kazakhstan, where there might be a third legal order. What is the rule of law that I actually follow? This means that when the citizen deviates, it's impossible to actually determine the order or the state which should be brought to bear to correct that deviation. So the citizen can, in essence, either ignore the rule of law or more properly choose the rule of law that best favors what they want to do. So, for example, there was a gentleman called Mr. Shepherd, who's not one of the nicest individuals in the world. Mr. Shepherd was a UK citizen, and Mr. Shepherd had a particular view that he liked to share. His view was a very anti-Semitic view. And Mr. Shepherd decided that he would share his anti-Semitic views via a website based in the United States. Now, what Mr. Shepherd did was a breach of the Public Order Act 1986. He was clearly acting illegally. He was a British citizen. He was aware of the British rule of law. He was aware he was breaching it. He didn't care. He felt he was an activist. He put this material on a website in California. It was available from the United Kingdom. When the British authorities went to arrest him, he jumped on a plane and went to the United States, where he claimed political asylum. He said he was being subjected to an attempt to control his right to free political speech. Thankfully, the United States authorities took a dim view of that and put Mr. Shepherd on a plane back to the UK. Mr. Shepherd was then arrested, and Mr. Shepherd was sentenced to 4 years in prison for his breach of the Public Order Act. So far, it sounds like the law is working, deviation and correction. But the interesting thing is, although Mr. Shepherd was put in prison, his website remained available. You could still go to the same website address and you could still download the same anti-Semitic material from within the United Kingdom. He had chosen for his website, for his speech, to be regulated by California, and the First Amendment protected him. He had made an active choice. Interestingly, the only thing that eventually made Mr. Shepherd take down the content was he became available for parole, and his parole authority told him that because he was still breaking the law, they wouldn't parole him. So Mr. Shepherd at that point voluntarily took the content down. I say voluntarily, he was left with little option. But this demonstrates the problem of too much law. Part of the problem is we have too much law going on, and people can choose which law they want. There is another problem of online communities, and it's this one. It's the hiding in the mass of online communities. You see, people talk about the internet like it's a place, and people talk about cyberspace like it's a space, and people talk about online community like it's a community like us here tonight. But it's not really. The internet is actually a communications media, and it allows people to form any type of tiny micro-community they want. And these tiny micro-communities, as I've already mentioned, don't feel the weight of the larger state or macro-community that we all share. So whereas we all have a shared experience of being at the moment within the United Kingdom and understanding what that stands for in terms of principles and rules of law, these micro-communities that form online have no experience of that. And they can form around anything. And this can be very positive. It allows the individual who's in a remote part of the American Midwest to make contact with somebody in Tokyo who shares their particular interest in Pokemon toys. But it also allows the isolated but unsettled individual who really just wants to agitate to make contact with the isolated and unsettled individual on the other side of the world who shares their peculiar isolated individual view. And in the real world, they would never meet. And they would sit, and they would moan, and they would whine, and they would say how unfair life was, and they would do nothing about it. But in cyberspace, they find someone else who also thinks it's unfair, and that leads to someone else. And before you know it, you've got a community of people who all think life's so unfair and want to do something about it. And when that community comes together, they have a shared community value in why is life so unfair, let's do something about it, rather than a shared community value in why the rule of law is important. They become micro-communities with micro-interests, and they hide, not deliberately, just naturally, within all the other communities. And this can make it very hard to find them. What it means is that law enforcement is difficult and costly in the online world. If you want to enforce an order against an online community, have deep pockets, because you're going to be spending a lot of money to lawyers and technology companies to capture who these people are, where they are, and then often making multiple applications to multiple courts and multiple jurisdictions, because each person is only going to be subject to the rule of law of one place. And until you can get them under the rule of the court that applies to them, they don't care. I really don't care if I get told tonight that there is an order of the court of Jordan against me for something I've said online. My response would be, so what? Come on, Court of Jordan, do your worst. I have no assets in Jordan. I'm not planning on traveling to Jordan anytime soon. Therefore, I'm not bothered about it. If that order of the court is then served and recognised by the Court of England and Wales down in Fleet Street, at the Royal Courts of Justice, then I suddenly become very interested in it. And that's the problem. You've got to find where the person is, and that's costly. And this is something these people are aware of. And so they will hide within these communities. And they also know if we ever do get an order against them, the likelihood is they've got no assets anyway. So it's not worth it. Then essentially they are unsuable. They're unlitigable because it will cost more than you will ever recover. Therefore, rule of what law? Who cares about the law? I just want to do what I want to do. So that's a general sort of overview of why online communities in particular are a particular problematic group. So let's sort of drill down into one of these types of groups, hackers. So we need to know how hackers think if we're going to actually provide any kind of legal rule which applies to them. So there's a number of reasons. In fact, this is only a selection. I've sort of picked the top 10 greatest hits. You could probably speak to 100 hackers and get 100 different reasons why they hack. But a sort of top 10 reasons why hackers actually get involved in hacking. Mostly, they do it because they want to, which sort of sounds tautologist, but it's true. Hackers do it simply for the challenge. I mean, you heard that the originating of hacking is in really good coding. And it still is today. It's wrong to say all hackers break the law. A number of hackers are good, positive people. A hacker is someone who writes good code, in essence. The trouble is the word hacker has become taken out of context and has become negativized. But really, a hacker in its truest form is someone who writes good code. So some people hack just because they want to see if they can. It's a challenge. You want to know if you're among the best of your community. Am I the best lawyer? Am I the best artist? Am I the best academic? Am I the best footballer? People always want to put themselves in a ranking with their peers. They want to see where they stand. And hackers hack to see if they can do things. And some hackers do it in a positive way within the community. Others do it in a negative way to kind of get points for doing things. Sometimes you hack to get into the community. Sometimes you have to kind of show you have the skills. So you'll be set a challenge. It's a bit like joining a street gang, except for you don't usually have to shoot someone. But it's the same kind of thing. You're asked to show you have the skills to get into the community. And even once you get in, you're required to continue to show your skills are progressing. So these are the social reasons that people hack. And we're talking about proper hackers here. We're going to come back in a minute to script kiddies because they're not proper hackers. Sometimes hackers have an economic reason. Sometimes they just want your computer. Your computer is valuable to them. It's got lots of storage space, it's connected to the internet, so they can use it to do other things. It's great for sending spam email and things like that. So grab hold of someone's computer, turn it into a robot, get that to send out spam emails. Then when somebody traces back where the spam emails came from, they don't come knocking at your door, they go knocking at the door of the other person. So sometimes you do it for economic reasons like that. Also, you might do it for criminal intent. the more obvious type of hacking, such as breaking into banking systems or financial systems, or an old favorite of breaking into gambling websites and taking them down just before a major sporting event and then demanding payment of a ransom to allow the website back up. That's quite a favorite one of some Eastern European gangs. They will attack gambling websites immediately before things like the FA Cup final, the Grand National, the Derby, and they will take them down and then say, well, we'll let your site back up for payment of a certain amount of money. So sometimes it is purely criminal, and that kind of thing is very, very obviously illegal. There is also an economic interest in preventing people doing these things, and these are called white hat hackers. And white hat hackers work on developing secure systems. So we shouldn't forget that there are people who work on the side of good as well as on the side of evil. There are also people who have personal reasons. Cyber stalking is a favorite one. So you want to stalk a particular individual, you might hack their Facebook account, you might hack their email account, you might hack a number of other accounts that tell you what they're doing, who their friends are, where they're going, all the kind of information that you might need if you've got a particular interest in an individual. That's a difficult one to deal with, and we'll mostly leave that to one side. Then the most interesting group in many ways are the people who do it for political reasons. These are called hacktivists, and these include, at least to some extent, anonymous. Hacktivists believe that hacking is a form of speech, and that it's a form of speech which forms part of the discourse with the state. They view hacking as being not dissimilar to things such as other forms of civil disobedience, such as sit-ins, such as marches, and those kinds of things. So they hack as a way to demonstrate their displeasure with the settlement of the state, but also they hack as a community. And as a community, they feel they represent a particular political view. They are by far the most interesting types of hackers. And they usually do it for civil disobedience or as a political statement. But sometimes they will actually do it in the employ of the state. So sometimes a hacker will actually hack because the state has employed them to do so, such as imposing viruses like Stuxnet virus and things like that, which is something that the US political establishment has used to try and hold back the Iranian development of nuclear capability. So hackers sometimes fulfill a role for the state as well as against the state. So we have a number of types of hackers. And I'm not going to talk about all of these on this slide here, but just gives you an idea of kinds of people who actually do the action. Black hat and white hat I've covered. You can see the right-hand side. That's sort of an interesting group. What I want to talk about is this thing on the bottom left, because they're not really hackers, but they're an interesting group. They're called script kiddies. And script kiddies are the cannon fodder of the hacker community. There's lots of them, and they're not very valuable, and you can kind of send them over the top to get shot. What are script kiddies? Script kiddies are people who think they're hackers, but actually really aren't. Script kiddies are usually children, actually, or students or other people who are young and perhaps not fully developed as members of the community. They're taken in by the excitement of being a hacker, and they join groups like Anonymous, and they're given tools to go and attack websites, and they feel for the first time, as teenagers often do, like they're part of something. We're part of something big here. We're active. Now, it's a very important part of groups like Anonymous to grab these script kiddies. They're young, they're ideological, but usually in a very wrong way, and they can be molded very quickly. Also, they don't know what the rule of law is. They've never heard of it, and even if they had heard of it, they don't care about it, because, hey, they're 15 or 16, and that's what you're supposed to do when you're that age. So what you do is you grab a script kiddie, you give them the tools they need to be able to carry out an attack. Usually you give them a low-orbit ion cannon. This makes them feel really cool. I've got a low-orbit ion cannon, and this is very powerful. And it is. That's a frightening thing. It sounds like a silly name, but it actually is very powerful. A low-orbit ion cannon is a silly name for something very important. It's just a piece of software. It's a piece of software that was developed to stress test systems. So essentially the rule of a low-orbit ion cannon is to check, if you are a systems engineer, how strong your system is, how robust your system is against extensive or heavy use or even attacks on the system. The low orbit ion cannon system has been made available widely on the internet through an open source software tool. Anybody can download one. If you want to go and be a hacker, go home tonight, Google for low orbit ion cannon, and you'll have one on your computer within 10 minutes. And it's not illegal to have a low orbit ion cannon, which sounds like it should be, but it's not. So you can have a low orbit ion cannon on your computer within 10 minutes. Then all you need is to know where to point your low orbit ion cannon. And you can be part of a community that brings down governments, or part of a community that brings down multinational companies, simply by pointing and clicking. It is in fact the laziest form of social activism you can get involved in. You don't even have to get dressed. You can do it in your pajamas while eating some toast. You point and click, and there you go. You're having an effect. And more than that, you're part of a community. And this community is entirely confident in what it's doing because it shares a certain type of value. Now, the interesting thing about Anonymous, and we'll come to more about them in just one second, is that ideology, that value, can be almost anything. Anonymous is very chameleon-like. They change their interests and they change their focuses rapidly, and they change it often. So today their interest might be free speech. Tomorrow their interest might be in ability to modify code. 2 days after, their interest might be protecting WikiLeaks. A week after that, it might be attacking WikiLeaks. It's very chameleon-like. It has no single core reason. And because of this, it's very hard to get hold of it. It's not a community in the traditional sense. It's a community which changes and which evolves and which is multinational and which does not recognize the rule of law of any state. And as I say, frankly, in most cases, wouldn't know what the rule of law was if you asked them about it. This is very problematic if you want to control them. So that brings me to my example for tonight. We've now talked about why the rule of law fails, the problems that lawmakers face in trying to, if you will, restructure the rule of law. Let's take Anonymous. How do we deal with Anonymous? Anonymous is the best known hacker group at the moment. I mean, in the past there have been others. One that I loved that was big in the late 90s was called Electro Hippies. They were really sweet. But Anonymous is nothing like Electro Hippies. Electro Hippies were true hacktivists in a sense. The first thing is, and herein you see the sort of academic and lawyer's sleight of hand. I talked about how do we regulate online communities. Well, Anonymous isn't really a community, and that's partly its problem. And it's the problem of many online communities. They're not really a community. They call themselves a collective rather than a community, which I think they think makes them sound like the Borg from Star Trek. But I think to everybody else doesn't mean much at all. So they're an online collective rather than a community. They are a hacktivist group, which if we go back to my typologies of why people hack, put them in types 8 and 9, they do mostly come together around activism, not around economic interest or criminal activity per se. They do it because they perceive a particular need for activism in an area. The problem with regulating Anonymous is deciding who to put in prison. They don't have any leadership. There's no kind of, unlike many hacker communities, you don't move up in ranking if you do something. Many hacker communities will reward you for a particularly good hack, and you will get advancement. But Anonymous don't do this. There is no leadership, there is no ranking. There is no doubt there are certain key players in Anonymous who do a lot more leadership and direction than others. And some of them have been arrested and have been imprisoned. But it doesn't really affect the operation of Anonymous. They continue anyway. Also, they don't use a single means of communication. There's nothing to regulate. They use a number of websites and discussion boards and fora to organize themselves around. The most popular one is 4chan, but they use a number of others as well. So there's no place to attach our legal order. There's no place to send our law enforcement officers into. They just move about without borders, without regulation, without physical presence. There is, though, as it says, a number of key activists, and some of them have been taken about. They're mostly the underemployed adult hackers who are bored, and some of the people who are genuine ideological hackers who are at the heart of it. But mostly they operate through a large number of script kiddies. As I said, the cannon fodder, they can easily send them over the top. And what kind of things do they do? Well, this is what I mean about them changing their focus from time to time and very rapidly. Here's just a number of different things that Anonymous have done, and we can talk a little bit about the 4 of them, and then I'll round up. One that they did, which is incredibly famous, is Operation Payback. And actually, Operation Payback itself has had many incarnations over the years. This is an Operation Payback attack on MasterCard. This was in response to WikiLeaks regulation, or attempted WikiLeaks regulation. The question was, how can you regulate WikiLeaks? Well, one way to regulate WikiLeaks is to cut off their money supply. Like any organization, they need money to operate. And so what the US government did in the follow-up to the release of the embassy cables was that they put pressure on a number of groups which cleared money to WikiLeaks to not make payments to them. And this included MasterCard and Visa Card, amongst others. Anonymous responded by announcing Operation Payback. And this is the Anonymous report, or the Anonymous call to arms on Operation Payback against MasterCard. So what are they saying to you? Well, basically, they are asking you to download a low-orbit ion cannon and then to point it at a particular address at a particular time. What does this do? Well, what this does is it sends a number of requests to the MasterCard server at the same time, overwhelming its capacity and causing it to go offline. Essentially, it's a denial of service attack. Once the denial of service attack stops, then the website should recover if it's been properly constructed. For Anonymous, this is a very clear way to show activism. It's requiring many people to join together in what they call a hive and to attack at the same time. It's like a sit-in. What we've done is we've all gone and we've occupied MasterCard's offices. And until we leave, nobody can come in or go out. And this is the way Anonymous views it. But it's very different to a sit-in at the same time. What you actually have in reality is a group of script kiddies who have been told by someone to point something dead cool called a low-orbit ion cannon at a particular place at a particular time, and to do it for ideological reasons. The ideological reasons here being protection of freedom of expression, that WikiLeaks is being regulated against. In truth, there was probably never any real threat to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks was probably quite safe, although cutting off of money is always quite a good form of regulating. So that's one thing. So that's about free expression. But it's not just free expression that they're interested in. Operation Payback itself has changed. That was in 2010. This is Operation Payback in 2011. What are they attacking this time? Well, they're attacking the New Zealand government. Why the New Zealand government this time? What is the political reason behind this? Surely New Zealand is one of the least offensive countries on the face of the planet, and certainly not one that deserves to be targeted by a low-orbit ion cannon. The reason for Operation Payback, I'm sorry the typeface is very small for those of you trying to read it on this, it's simply the size that they have on their page. The reason for the attack this time is that the New Zealand government had just passed, and I'll try and read it off of here, a new piece of legislation called the Copyright Infringing File Sharing Amendment Bill. And essentially what this was doing is the equivalent of what the UK is hoping to do under the Digital Economy Act. It was a requirement that internet service providers log ISP addresses of individuals who were sharing material in infringement of copyright law. For Anonymous, this was an infringement on their right to free expression and, more importantly, an infringement on their right of privacy. So they said, surely an individual has the right to view the internet in private without this being recorded by their government. As a result, they instigated Operation Payback against the New Zealand government to take down the New Zealand Parliament website. That was the attack in this case. So you were to point your low-orbit ion cannon at the website of the New Zealand Parliament and to take it down to demonstrate your disgust with this particular activity. Now, this all sounds good so far. These are quite, I suppose, laudable political aims if you're an activist. Protection of free speech, protection of privacy. But Anonymous is not always so high-minded in what they do. One is Operation Sony. It still might sound to some people a reasonably good reason to attack a commercial website, but it is starting to sound a very much less sure-footed reason. What we have here is that Sony had instigated litigation against 2 hackers who were affiliated with the Anonymous movement, who had hacked their PlayStation. Essentially what they had done is a process called jailbreaking. They had freed their PlayStation from the controls that Sony placed on it for the purposes of running their own software on it, what's called homebrew. Now, Sony took action against these individuals. This is an infringement of copyright law and is an infringement of the licenses that apply when you buy a PlayStation. And in response to this, Anonymous came to the aid of their fellow hackers and announced Operation Sony, where you were to attack sonystyle.com, which I think is part of the Sony PlayStation Network system. So here what we're finding is that the movement is more about protecting their own rather than making a political statement. So because it was hackers that were attacked, we shall respond back. But still, maybe arguably, you might think that's a reasonable enough reason for activism. You need to protect the activists if activism is to work. Otherwise, they'll be made an example of. The last example I have got show that the activism, though, can kind of fall apart. This is a very local campaign. This is a campaign against a school. It's against a school in New Zealand. I think it's in New Zealand. Yeah, I'm sure it is. It's against, no, it's Australia, my apologies. This is against a school in Australia that excluded one of their pupils. The pupil in question, I've forgotten his real name, but he goes by the name Zangief Kids. And he became a minor internet cause célèbre when a viral video of him started circulating on YouTube. And basically what happened is that according to the viral video, there was a bully who was attacking this chap, Zangief Kid. That's not his real name. Casey Haynes is his real name. There was a video of this bully attacking him, and he responds by basically, the bully was a little kid, actually. He was quite a big kid, and he's supposedly not reacting until eventually he gets really annoyed and hits the little kid and knocks him flat on his back. The school suspended him and removed him from the school because of his attack on the other kid. Now, it came out afterwards that probably what had been going on is something had happened before which had not been videotaped, in which the smaller kid had been bullied by Mr. Haynes before the event that was recorded was seen. And this is probably the information that the school had when they made their decision. Despite this, Anonymous, probably because he was someone who was affiliated with the Anonymous movement in his local area, attacked the school and did a denial of service attack on an individual school. This is not anything to do with political ideology. This is simply attacking because we don't like a decision. This has gone beyond, is the rule of law right? This has gone down to the level, is the rule of the school right? And they have just ignored it and decided that they will operate out with it. So this is the problem we have. The question is, whose law do we apply? Whose law is the correct rule of law? Who is legitimate to those people to regulate them? Somebody must be. Somebody must have the authority to regulate what's going on. And traditional lawmakers have taken a number of steps to try to build systems to do this. So we see things like the European Convention on Cybercrime, or the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, which requires that all signatories make it illegal in their domestic law for people to gain unauthorized access to computer networks and systems. Essentially, we all agree that this is a criminal event. But despite that, these people refuse to be regulated by this because they don't see the rule of law as applying to them. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us in a very unfortunate position. We need a legitimate lawmaker. Who is the legitimate lawmaker for these people? We also need legal certainty. And there is certainly no clear evidence that they are aware who the correct lawmaker is for them. They're all heterogeneous communities, and these heterogeneous communities don't recognize the single values, perhaps, of the homogeneous community that is us. For them, they have a number of incentives and very little risks. Your chances of actually being arrested and prosecuted are very minimal. So regulating these communities through traditional legal methods is, for the moment, failing. There is no doubt about it. It doesn't mean it's destined to fail. It simply means that we have to decide how serious we are about regulating these communities. It's much a matter of assets as anything else. How much money are we willing to put into this? Until 2169, when the law catches up, the best advice I can give to you is the 3 laws of secure computing. If you're worried about someone hacking your computing, follow these 3 rules, and you will be fine. And I think that's probably a good point to call an end to this. Thank you.